The timing starts here and it ends when it leaves the bracket. We could do another quick scope cycle counter. We'll name it stat cleanup array. In the console, you can just type stat named events to start tracing. It is doing the validate array, but this should generate us a capture. And then I will stop my trace here. So we can open that up and see a lot of profile data. We can already see right here that our stat validate or build array is taking up 6 seconds. It is the time that's not consumed by these sub-icicles. And so to do that package, we just click Platforms, Windows, make sure development is selected, and we will run the individual package game. And you can see it is capturing right now. It is live for test validate array. So now it is validating. Here it only took 483, so it's a bit faster in the package client. How do you make sense of the numbers that you're seeing in Insights? The thing about that is there are 1,000 milliseconds in a second, and you're dividing that up among 60 frames. And so you see 16.67 milliseconds per frame. So if you're wondering, is this too slow? 483 milliseconds. We only have 33 of those milliseconds to use. So this is way out of budget. Hey, so this is going to be a quick video on profiling with Unreal Insights. So I had a previous test here that compared the dynamic cast from C++ to the Unreal cast. And part of that test was setting up an array of actors, and that array is rather large. I figured that would be a good thing to measure as an example of how to set up a session for profiling. We can go in here and we can just add some scope markers. And so we'll say the quick scope cycle counter, and we'll give it a name, stat, and we'll just call this the function name, so validate build array. And what we'll do is we'll nest some cycle counters inside of it. So what the scope refers to in this counter is just when this bracket is left, the timing starts here and it ends when it leaves the bracket. So if we were to put it in this lambda here, we could do another quick scope cycle counter. We'll name it stat cleanup array. Actually, let's prefix these with the validate build array so we can see all of them. We'll say validate build array, cleanup array. Copy that. And then down here, we'll add another scope that only lasts for this scope of being rebuilt. And we'll name that one build array. And that should give us some nesting with scopes. So this scope should encompass the whole thing, and the building should be a subscope. And I guess that is all we need to test. So initially, I'll just run this as debug game. Well, it's going to build, and then we can test the scopes from inside the editor. So I've just ran this as debug game initially, which is not optimized. We'll switch that to development in a moment, but you can actually profile in the editor, though things are generally slower in the editor. It can give you a quick litmus test for if something is egregiously bad. So I accidentally lost that recording, so I'll just do it again real quick. So with the editor running, there's this little trace section down here for Unreal Insights. So if we open that up, there's a button, Unreal Insights Session Browser. If we click that, it opens up a session browser where you can view your captured data. Now, if this is open and you launch the editor or launch a standalone game, it automatically starts capturing live, is what it says. It'll just capture whatever you run. So this is an easy way to capture the startup of a game or something. Anyways, we have an old capture there. And I did this previously, which is captured here. We'll review that, but I just want to go through the steps of showing how to get a capture like that. And so with this up, there is a little section down here that is stat named events. You can check that or uncheck it. Or in the console, you can just type stat named events to enable it. And so to start a trace, you need to click this little red button here to start tracing, or it goes red once you click it. But this means it is capturing. And if we look at the session browser, you can see this little live section, and it is now capturing another profile trace. So if we go in here and we run the command to validate our array, it is doing the validate array, and it has large numbers, so I'm frozen at the moment. But this should generate us a capture. So we'll stop pi, and then I will stop my trace here. And I'll go to the session viewer, and I'll rename that, hitting F2, and I'll say BP event test editor 2. And so it should be the same as this one for the most part. So we can open that up and see a lot of profile data, and it takes a moment to get buffered. We can already see right here that our stat validate or build array is taking up 6 seconds. And so over here in the timer section, we could type the prefix of our scope, so stat validate or build array. And we can see that we got the build array and the cleanup array and the one that's the top level. So if we change the sizing of these markers, you can look at timings. And so when I ran it this time, it said that the build array took up 6 seconds, including everything underneath the scope marker. So we have these inclusive and exclusive markers. So you can add sections here by going to right-clicking view column and checking these boxes. So if yours looks a little bit different, you might just have to check some of these boxes. So let's right-click, view columns, and check the boxes here. But the inclusive is including the scopes under it. So for example, if we look at this spawn actor, it says its inclusive time was 110 microseconds, and the exclusive time is 32 microseconds. So exclusive time is all of this gap here that's not consumed by these. It is the time that's not consumed by these sub-icicles underneath this thing here. And so generally I look at the inclusive time just because that kind of encompasses the total marker, but sometimes you might want to know what it was doing except for the stuff that's already marked. So in this case, something's happening here that's not marked up. Anyways, so let's close out that session and we'll open up the session from last time. Did not get a recording of. Actually, the previous attempt was this, not the blueprint event test. So we'll say cast perf populate array 2. And if we open up the previous one, you can see, if we look at validate build array as it's loading the data, we can see it's about the same, 6.1 seconds for inclusive time. So if we want to actually get a more accurate performance capture, you can package the game and run it as standalone. And so when you download the engine from the Epic Games launcher, there's a few build configurations that you can use to test, and development is the closest. If you build from source, you can get test, which has less optimizations. So what we'll do is we'll build the game for development instead of debug game. Shipping is not going to let us use the console commands. So if we use development, we can package that. And so to do that package, we just click Platforms, Windows, make sure development is selected, and then Package Project. And it will ask us where it would like to save it. And so I've already got a folder selected here, development build, and I'll just select, now that I've selected the folder, you can show the output log and you'll see it package. And this will take a little bit of time. It doesn't take too long for a small project like this, but be prepared to wait a little bit. So the packaging is complete, and now if we go to the folder that we had specified, and then into Windows, we can see there's a standalone executable here. And with the session view being open, it actually captured the packaging, it looks like. So I'm going to delete those by hitting delete. And we will just close the editor, but we still have the session view open, and we will run the individual package game. And so this is the default level of the project. And now what we can do is hop over to the session view, and you can see it is capturing right now. It is live. And so what we're going to do now is enable stat named events. Named events. So now our scopes should show up in the performance capture. And I'll run our test again. So that is going to be command test validate array. So now it is validating. It built the array. And then we can close out the game. And that should stop the trace, and we'll say perf populate array development standalone. We will open up that trace and we paste the scope markers. And you can see this time we got the cleanup array and everything, and the data is still loading. You can zoom out, find the game thread, and zoom in. And I'll just highlight that event so we can see where the hitch was. And here it only took 483 microseconds to do the exact same thing that it took to do before. So it's a bit faster in the packaged client. And we can highlight the build array, which is the one that takes the most time. And we can highlight the cleanup, which is going to be when we close down the game. So if I zoom out and find it over here, and we can see that that just took 48 microseconds. Cleaning the array was pretty quick. Now this didn't destroy the actors or anything, it just mostly emptied the array. And so when you do this search, you can add a filter, and we'll do stat name. You can use these to navigate between them. So if you have the same thing popping up multiple times, you can cycle them that way. And so that is the very bare bone basics of using Unreal Insight. And so I hope that helps get you started. There's a lot more here, obviously. So this is a very powerful tool, and it's just built right into the engine. It is really easy to open up and inspect your game's performance. And so it gives you a detailed flame graph or icicle graph as to what is happening in your game. But you should know that these stats do add some overhead. So when you add them, there's going to be, if something is really fast, just adding a stat will potentially make it show up here when otherwise it would be almost instantaneous. So there is some overhead, but for most things, it seems to be pretty reliable and giving you a base idea of how long stuff takes. So the last thing to think about is, how do you make sense of the numbers that you're seeing in Insights? Well, there are two common target frame rates, 60 frames per second and 30 frames per second. But you generally don't see things measured in frames per second. It's better to measure them in the exact times so you can make more educated decisions about what you're seeing. And so the question then becomes, at 60 frames per second, how many seconds is that per frame? or how long is that per frame? And so the way to think about that is you have 1 second divided into 60 frames. So that gives you 0.0167 seconds. More commonly, you'll see it represented in milliseconds. And so the way to think about that is there are 1,000 milliseconds in a second, and you're dividing that up among 60 frames. And so you see 16.67 milliseconds per frame for a target of 60 frames per second. If you're targeting 30 frames per second, it's the same idea. You have 1 second, and that is divided up into 30 frames. So that is 0.0333 seconds per frame, or in milliseconds. That is 1,000 milliseconds in a second divided up among 30 frames. So that's 33.33 ms. So I hope that helps you make sense of Unreal Insights. You can see over here we have ms for the milliseconds, and none of these are quite reaching to be seconds. But if we open up the one in the editor view, sometimes you do see that it ends up taking seconds. So this time in the editor it took 6.1 seconds, whereas the same thing in a packaged development client only took 483 milliseconds. And so if you're wondering, is this too slow? 483 milliseconds. Well, if we go back to our budget, it took us 483 milliseconds. Let's say we're targeting 30 frames per second. We only have 33 of those milliseconds to use. So this is way out of budget. If this only happens in one single frame, that's going to be a hitch. Maybe that's okay. Most likely you want to try to amortize that or time slice it over multiple frames. That's how you think about these things. I hope that helps. Let me know if you have any questions or comments below. Again, this is just the introduction to Insights. There's a lot more here to unpack, but this should get you started. I hope that helps.